Well, I think I should start by defending my country, which has just been accused of lying. And, and I don't think the charge is really accurate, because to accuse someone of lying presupposes that they have a certain capacity to tell the truth. Like, you don't say that a 2-year-old is lying, you know, if the 2-year-old says something false. And since the presupposition can't be sustained, I think the charge of lying is really unfair. So I think you should withdraw it. Yeah. The United States has had 4 presidents who've received the Nobel Peace Prize. I haven't checked, but I presume that's a record for heads of state. And all 4 have left their imprint on Latin America, on our little region over here that has never bothered anybody. As Secretary of War Henry Stimson described the hemisphere in May 1945. He was at that time explaining to the world what the post-war global system would be. And one of its conditions would be that all regional organizations must be disbanded, with the exception of our own, which are to be expanded, including our little region over here, the Western Hemisphere, and in fact, much more ambitious aims which were spelled out and indeed implemented. And this was correct. His position was correct, as others explained. For example, the very influential liberal Democrat Abe Fortas, who said that for us to expand our systems, including our little region over here, is part of our obligation to the security of the world, because what is good for us is good for the world. That's self-evident. Well, if we look through the 4 presidents and their imprint, it was significant. So let's start with Theodore Roosevelt, the first one. Roosevelt was a shocking racist. I don't use the analogy lightly, but it's a fact that you have to go to the Nazi archives to find anything similar. So here's a couple of his examples about our little region here. The expansion of the peoples of white or European blood during the past 4 centuries has been fraught with lasting benefit to most of the peoples already dwelling in the lands over which the expansion took place. That's despite what the remnants of Native Americans or blacks or Filipinos or others might mistakenly believe. Actually, genocide denial has been a leading and highly valued feature of the intellectual and moral culture in the United States, and remains so right until the present. Striking examples right today. With regard to the conquest of half of Mexico, Roosevelt explained that it was inevitable and in the highest degree desirable for the good of humanity at large that the American people should ultimately crowd out the Mexicans. It was out of the question to expect Texans to submit to the mastery of the weaker race. And of course, stealing Panama from Colombia was also in the highest degree desirable for the good of humanity. I won't go on with Teddy Roosevelt, whose statue graces Mount Rushmore. The second Nobel Peace Prize laureate, also on Mount Rushmore, is Woodrow Wilson, the most honored and arguably the most vicious and brutal of the Nobel Prize laureates. His invasion of Haiti, for example, killed thousands of people, maybe 20,000 according to Haitian historians, restored virtual slavery, left much of the country in ruins. Wilson is famous as an apostle of democracy, and he demonstrated his love of democracy by sending the Marines in to disband Parliament at gunpoint for a good reason. They had refused to pass what was called progressive legislation that allowed U.S. corporations to buy up the country. So therefore they were kicked out, but since we do believe in elections, there was a referendum under Marine rule in which 5% of the population participated and 99% voted for the progressive legislation. So American corporations proceeded to buy up what remained of Haiti, which was once the richest colony in the world. It's worth remembering. Now maybe the symbol of hopelessness and despair, tribute to the West. At the same time, Wilson sent the Marines to invade the Dominican Republic. That was almost as bad as Haiti, but not quite, because as the military commanders pointed out, in the Dominican Republic, they were spics, not niggers. So you had to treat them a little better. Not much, but some. Both countries were left under the rule of the vicious National Guards. It's a policy that had been first instituted in the Philippines a few years earlier, and the Philippines remain under their rule in effect. That followed in Hispaniola decades of torture and terror and violence and misery. All of this comes down to us in history under the framework of what's called Wilsonian idealism, which is a leading principle of U.S. foreign policy, as any of you know who've taken courses in modern history and international relations. Well, the third Nobel laureate, presidential Nobel laureate, was Jimmy Carter, for whom human rights was the soul of our foreign policy. His policies in Latin America were explained by Robert Pastor. He's a Latin American specialist and way at the dovish extreme. Pastor explained why the administration had to support the murderous Somoza regime in Nicaragua, and when they could no longer sustain him, they had to try to maintain the US-trained National Guard, even, I'm quoting Pastor now, even after it was massacring the population with the brutality that a nation usually reserves for its enemy, killing some 40,000 people. And the reason why the Carter administration had to keep supporting them is elementary. Quote Pastor again, "The United States did not want to control Nicaragua or other nations of the region, but it also did not want developments to get out of control. It wanted Nicaraguans to act independently, except when doing so would affect U.S. interests adversely." That's a fair statement of policy at the dovish extreme. The Cold War was, of course, invoked, but it was not remotely relevant. What we do find, however, is an operative principle that runs right through history and is recognized to their credit even by Reaganite scholarship, serious Reaganite scholars, who concede ruefully that democracy is a good thing in the eyes of U.S. administrations, if and only if it's consistent with strategic and economic interests. The leading scholar, neo-Reaganite Thomas Carruthers, concludes that for some crazy, strange reason, all U.S. presidents are schizophrenic. There's just a curious pathology which settles over people when they enter into the White House, and they do sincerely support democracy, but with this funny clause added, if and only if it conforms to U.S. strategic and economic interests. So it's fine in Eastern Europe, but different in Central America, or Latin America, or in fact anywhere in our little region over here or elsewhere. Well, on to the fourth Nobel laureate, President Obama. His first major act in Latin America, not actually the first, I'll come back to others, but the first major one was to separate the United States from almost all of Latin America and from Europe by accepting the military coup that overthrew Haitian democracy. This is virtually alone. The United States refused to withdraw its ambassador, as even European countries had done, and Latin American countries, and in general sort of repeated some of the words of the Organization of American States, but as you just heard, repeated them with its fingers crossed. The United States quickly recognized the elections that were held under the military regime.
You said Haiti, but you meant Honduras.
When?
Just now.
Did I say Haiti? Yeah. Sorry, I meant Honduras. Trouble is, it's all the same, so it's very easy to interchange. In fact, you can repeat the sentences and interchange the names. It makes it very easy. Makes it very easy to give talks about the foreign policy. Actually, so thanks for the correction. As I said, the Obama administration very quickly recognized the elections alone, almost alone. The American ambassador, Obama's ambassador to Honduras, Hugo Lawrence, called the elections a great celebration of democracy. He wasn't being original. He was echoing Kennedy's ambassador, Kennedy Johnson ambassador to Brazil, Lincoln Gordon. This was right after the US-backed military coup in 1964. It was prepared by the Kennedy administration, but carried out a few weeks after the assassination. That coup was extremely important. It instituted the first of the neo-Nazi style national security states that spread through the continent with a notable domino effect that led to the worst repression, worst plague of repression in the history of the hemisphere, which is saying a lot. Lincoln Gordon exulted that the coup was the most decisive victory for freedom in the mid-20th century. He added quietly that the democratic forces that had taken over would create a greatly improved climate for private investments. So like Honduras, the Brazilian coup was a great celebration of democracy. And in Honduras, the effects are presumably similar. And in the Honduran case, as you heard in the songs before, it will also crucially preserve for Washington its military base at Palmarola. During the 1980s, that was called the unsinkable aircraft carrier for the US-run forces attacking Nicaragua from their Honduran bases under Ronald Reagan's terrorist wars in Central America in the 80s. And that base is increasingly valuable to the United States because as a result of quite significant changes in South America primarily, the United States has been kicked out of all of its military bases there. The last one was just a few months ago. It was expelled from the Manta military base in Ecuador. The President Correa of Ecuador, when he was running in the recent election, said that he would indeed permit the US to retain the Manta base, but only on condition that the United States allowed Ecuador to have a military base near Miami. And that wasn't accepted for some reason, so the US was expelled from the Manta base. Well, it's not, the empire doesn't give up, and the US is reacting. It's since gained access to 7 military bases in the one country of South America that remains a loyal client, Colombia. And President Obama added on 2 more quietly, 2 naval bases in Panama, another quasi-colony. All of this is part of a much more general program of remilitarizing Latin America to try to combat the dangerous moves towards independence. That also includes reconstituting the 4th Fleet, naval fleet, which operates in South American and Caribbean waters. It was dismantled in 1950, but it has just been reinstituted. Now it has these 2 new bases in Panama. The base in Colombia is one of the bases in Colombia. The Palenquero base is intended, as was revealed by a leaked Air Force document, it's intended to be a base for surveillance of the hemisphere, and the longer-term plans are to link it up with the new Africa Command, which extends over Africa, and that becomes part of the global surveillance and control system, which permits aggression and intervention anywhere over the world for the benefit of humanity, of course. That goes without saying. Well, on the there's also an increase, a sharp increase in training of Latin American officers whose their mission, official mission, is to deal with youth gangs and radical populism. Radical populism has a very special meaning in Latin American history. Well, on the Honduran elections again, Obama's State Department official in charge of Western Hemisphere affairs, Valenzuela, was just quoted, he told the press that the issue is not who is going to be the next president. The Honduran people decided that. They chose between two supporters of the military coup, while the elected president was holed up in the Brazilian embassy. Obama's representative to the OAS, the Organization of American States, meanwhile instructed the backward Latin peons that they should join the United States in the real world. They should abandon their world of magic realism and should recognize the military coup just as Big Brother did. Obama did break new ground in support for the military coup. There are two U.S. government-funded organizations that are technically supposed to support democracy in the world. One of them is the International Republican Institute, the other is the National Democratic Institute. And since the entire spectrum of opinion is represented, we can be sure that there's going to be an honest outcome. Well, the International Republican Institute, which is marginally more reactionary and violent, regularly supports military coups to overthrow elected governments without blinking an eye. Recently in Venezuela in 2002 and Haiti in 2004. But in those two cases, the National Democratic Institute held back. The Democrats weren't in office then, including these two cases. In Honduras, for the first time, Obama's National Democratic Institute agreed to observe the elections under military rule, unlike the Organization of American States and the United Nations and others who are still wandering in the realms of magic realism. Well, notice that this is the third military coup in the new millennium. The first was in Venezuela in 2002. That one was openly supported by Washington, which had to back down and turn to subversion after the coup was overturned by a popular uprising. The second, in 2004, was in Haiti. That was carried out by the two traditional torturers of Haiti, France and the United States, which have essentially destroyed the country. They intervened. The elected president, Jean-Bertrand Aristide, was packed off to Central Africa. The United States has been trying to bar him from the Western Hemisphere, but some of those magic realists aren't entirely obeying, so he's been allowed in now and then. The Honduran coup is the third coup in this millennium. Obama's contribution to the quite traditional pattern. Well, I don't have to explain because it's obvious that connections between the United States and Honduras are so close, military, economic, and others, that the United States had enormous leverage. And it would have been a very simple matter to join Europe and Latin America to protect Honduran democracy. But Obama clearly preferred the traditional policy. The traditional policy is concealed under all kind of pleasant rhetoric of the kind I quoted before, but it's also understood. So scholarship understands it quite well. One of the standard scholarly histories of hemispheric relations by a well-known British scholar, Gordon Connell Smith, says that while paying lip service to the encouragement of representative democracy in Latin America, the United States has a strong interest in just the reverse, apart from procedural democracy, especially the holding of elections, which only too often have proved farcical, like the one we've just seen. There's a problem in authentic democracy. The problem is that it might respond to popular concerns. Well, as Connell Smith goes on to explain, the United States has been concerned with fostering the most favorable conditions for her private overseas investment, and accordingly there is no serious question of U.S. intervention in the case of the many right-wing military coups. Right-wing is a kind of an understatement, except, one may add, of course, intervention to support or to initiate them, as is constantly done. But matters are quite different, still quoting, when her own concept of democracy, closely identified with private capitalistic enterprise, is threatened by communism. And communism is a common cover term that's used to refer to the threat of independent development that's responsive to domestic concerns. It really takes a large dose of what has sometimes been called intentional ignorance not to see the glaringly obvious facts which have remarkable consistency and clarity. Well, there is, of course, another U.S. Nobel Prize winner, Peace Prize winner, who's left his imprint on the hemisphere, Henry Kissinger, was quoted before. There are more than enough tortured and mutilated corpses, more than enough widows and orphans, and more than enough misery and starvation to testify to his contributions, so I'll ignore them and keep to some of his profound thoughts. When he was supporting Reagan's terrorist wars, Kissinger explained that if we cannot manage Central America, it will be impossible to convince threatened nations in the Persian Gulf and in other places that we know how to manage the global equilibrium. The latter phrase is a euphemism for our rule of the globe. In other words, we may not frighten them enough to accept our orders unless at least we can manage Central America right nearby. When Kissinger was leading the effort to overthrow the Allende government, the elected government in Chile, his National Security Council observed that if the United States could not control Latin America, it could not expect to achieve a successful order elsewhere in the world, that is, to impose its rule effectively in the world. So a lot is at stake in controlling Latin America and in managing Central America. And in fact, the overthrow of democracy in Honduras takes its place in deeply rooted, very consistent policies and attitudes in government, in the intellectual culture, and the media, much of scholarship, and so on. It traces back to the earliest foreign policy efforts of the newly founded republic, the infant empire, as George Washington called it. The most famous document is the Monroe Doctrine in the 1820s, which said, essentially, keep out. This is our little region over here. Well, that couldn't be implemented at the time. There was a deterrent. It wasn't the Russians, it was the British. The British fleet was just too powerful, and the British Army was. That's why Canada is not technically a colony of the United States, though it's more and more becoming one in practice. But several efforts to invade Canada were beaten back by British force. And the U.S. also couldn't conquer Cuba as it wanted to do in the 1820s because the British fleet was in the way. And in general, the Monroe Doctrine couldn't be implemented. But it was understood by the deeper thinkers that that was a temporary affair. John Quincy Adams, who's considered the great grand strategist of early American foreign policy, and in fact probably the author, certainly the intellectual author of Manifest Destiny and the Monroe Doctrine, he explained in the 1820s that, yes, we can't conquer Cuba now, the British are in the way, but if we wait, Cuba will sooner or later fall into our hands by the laws of political gravitation, the way an apple falls from a tree, meaning we're going to get stronger and stronger, the British are going to get weaker and weaker, and pretty soon we'll be able to conquer Cuba. Well, that in fact happened in 1898. Theodore Roosevelt, who was incidentally an incredible charlatan, put on his uniform, made sure the photographs were taken properly, and led the famous effort of the Rough Riders to help what was called liberating Cuba. In fact, what it meant was preventing Cuba from liberating itself from Spain, as it was just about to do, and turning it into a virtual colony, as it remained until 1959, and it has been under constant, unremitting terror and economic warfare ever since, for pretty good reasons. This is the first foreign policy goal of the infant empire, and for it to move towards independence is pretty shocking. In fact, we know why the attack on Cuba is so savage, and it is, to realize how savage it is, you really have to look at the details. I mean, it began with extensive terror, straight terror, under Kennedy and Johnson, and went on. But particularly savage and striking is the economic warfare. I mean, huge resources go into ensuring, to tracking every ship in the world, to make sure that it doesn't stop somewhere and pick up some steel that might have Cuban nickel in it. And if it does, it's going to have to be barred from US ports. Much more effort goes into this than to, say, tracking terrorist finances and sort of minor things like that. It's really an obsession. And the reasons are explained in the internal documents. That it's a very free country, so we have a lot of internal records. You go back to the Kennedy-Johnson years, the explanation was that all of this is necessary at that time, significant terror activities, because of Cuba's successful defiance of policies going back 150 years, meaning to the Monroe Doctrine. No Russians, that's to scare the domestic population. It's successful defiance of the Monroe Doctrine, which established that this little region over here is for us to run, and independent countries are not tolerated. The Cuba case is is an interesting one in the study of American foreign policy. I mean, for decades, the American population, U.S. population, has been in favor of normalization of relations with Cuba by large margins. But it's normal for the population to be disregarded. That's called democracy. But what's less normal is that American business is in favor of it. Now, typically, foreign policy is almost a reflex of business interests. But in this case, major sectors of American industry, agribusiness, pharmaceuticals, energy corporations, big guys, are in favor of normalizing relations. But the state is overruling them. And that is unusual. And I think that reflects one of the few really significant principles of international affairs. Most of it is kind of at the level of Wilsonian idealism, but there are some real principles. And one of the major principles, I think, ought to be called the mafia doctrine. International affairs are very much like the mafia. The Godfather does not tolerate disobedience. It's too dangerous. It doesn't matter how tiny it is. It can be some small storekeeper somewhere who isn't paying his protection money. That can't be tolerated because, to borrow Kissinger's terms, the virus can spread contagion elsewhere. Others may get the same idea. So it's not enough to send your goons in to get the money, because the Don really doesn't need it. You have to beat them to a pulp and make it clear to everyone else that this kind of behavior is not tolerated. Maybe in the realms of magic realism, but not in the real world. Here we have to make sure that there's discipline, and successful defiance cannot be tolerated. It's a bad message. Actually, Arthur Schlesinger, well-known liberal historian who was Kennedy's one of his chief Latin American advisors, he explained it when he presented to the incoming president, President Kennedy, the report of a Latin American mission that Kennedy had established to sort of lay out policies for the hemisphere. And he pointed out that Cuba is a real problem. And the problem, he said, is the spread of the Castro idea of taking matters into your own hands, which might influence other countries in Latin America where people are suffering from the same kind of repression and violence. And once you allow that, then the virus might spread contagion and the whole system of domination might erode. And that's what you hear consistently in internal policy planning from liberals like Schlesinger and Kennedy to whatever you call Henry Kissinger. I'm not sure. I don't want to use the word that comes to mind, so you make up your word. But right across the spectrum. And it's a very rational policy, which is why it is never abandoned. To the public, it's called the domino theory. You know, if Vietnam falls, Ho Chi Minh will conquer California, and so on and so forth. That's what you present to the public. And of course, when these things never happen, you say, well, it was a mistake, you know, it didn't understand, and so on. But the authentic domino theory is never retracted, because it's right. It is perfectly true that if you allow successful defiance somewhere, others might get the same idea and try to take matters into their own hands, and pretty soon the system of domination erodes and collapses. Actually, that's what's beginning to happen now in South America, and it's very worrisome to US planners. That's why you have the kinds of actions I briefly mentioned before. Well, that's, all of this is pretty straight in the internal record. As I said, we're lucky to be in a very free country where we can really get access to what internal planning is. We're also, from another point of view, lucky to be in a very disciplined country, so nobody ever hears about it. But it's there if you want to do the work. For the National Security Council, highest planning body, back in the early 50s, laid out the primary threat to US interests in Latin America. It said the primary interest is posed by radical and nationalistic regimes that appeal to the masses of the population and seek to satisfy the popular demand for immediate improvement in the low living standards of the masses and development for domestic needs. And these tendencies conflict with the demand for a political and economic climate conducive to private investment with adequate repatriation of profits and protection of our raw materials. The last phrase is George Kennan, who explained that it's just kind of like an accident that the raw materials happen to be somewhere else. They're really ours. We got to protect them. And in fact, a large part of subsequent history follows from these conceptions, which are completely unchallenged and make perfect sense. You know, if you're the Godfather, those are exactly the right principles, so they're not challenged. That's Zelaya's problem. He was starting to stray from orthodoxy. He was beginning to offer a very mild challenge to these fundamental principles. The New York Times, using terminology that is rare for them, so I give them credit, reported that the coup reflected a class division, rare term in U.S. Discourse. It reflected a yawning political and economic divide. For the small upper class, Zelaya was becoming a threat to what they called democracy, meaning the rule of the most powerful business and political forces in the country. Okay, that's successful defiance. And he was really going pretty far. For example, he raised the minimum wage a little bit, a miserable minimal wage in a country where 60% of the population live in poverty. But if you're an observant Don, you notice things like that, and it's dangerous. You start with raising the minimum wage, pretty soon you lose control of the world. If we can't control Latin America, we can't control the world. So plainly he had to go. It wasn't a small thing. Well, Honduras is a sufficiently small and weak state, yeah, and it's sufficiently under U.S. control so that it was possible to resort to the classic method, military coup, concealed, of course, with some polite rhetoric. Well, there have been major challenges to U.S. rule, and they continue, and they're taking new forms. Actually, last month, we had an enlightening demonstration of our incapacity, or maybe unwillingness, to consider what these challenges tell us. It was a very interesting month. The month, November 2009, it was largely devoted to celebration of the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union, surely a memorable event. And there were eloquent testimonies to the lesson that we learned from these amazing events, the power of nonviolence and the power of idealism. And that's true enough if we keep ourselves focused, laser-like, on the crimes of enemies. Looks a little different when we look elsewhere. So, for example, there was another 20th anniversary in November, just 1 week after the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. That was the anniversary of the termination of a 25-year campaign to crush a major challenge to U.S. rule in our little region over here. That campaign began in 1962 with Pope John Paul XXIII and Vatican II. In the same year, incidentally, 1962, John F. Kennedy shifted the mission of the Latin American military, which of course we determined, from hemispheric defense to internal security. Hemispheric defense is kind of like an antiquated holdover from the Second World War, but internal security means something. It means violent crushing of any disobedience internal to the society. Well, Vatican II, 1962, set forth, gave a stimulus to a very important movement in Latin America, extremely important. The Vatican II, in effect, was the first attempt in 1700 years to restore the Christianity. Christianity had been captured by the Roman Empire in the 4th century and changed from the religion of the persecuted to the religion of the persecutors. It's quoting the theologian Hans Kung. The Emperor Constantine took over Christianity. It had been a radical pacifist religion. So, of course, in the first 3 centuries, there were martyrs and persecutions and so on. But it became the religion of the Roman Empire. The cross, which had been the symbol of the suffering of the poor, was on the shield of the empire. And since then, it's been essentially the rule of the rich, the religion of the rich. Well, there have been some attempts to change it, but they were crushed pretty quickly. But Vatican II was the first major attempt. It was, King says, I think rightly, a real revolution in the history of the church. And the Don didn't fail to notice it. What happened was that, especially in Latin America, you got the beginnings of what came to be called liberation theology. Priests, nuns, laypersons went out to the peasantry, organized base communities, as they were called, encouraged people to read the Gospels, see what they actually said, listen to their radical pacifist message, and try to begin to organize to take your affairs into your own hands. That's dangerous. and didn't take long for a reaction to set in. In fact, the first major reaction was in 1964, the one I mentioned, the establishment of the first national security state in Brazil. And then comes the domino effect. Brazil's a big, powerful country, and of course there's somebody up there in the north pushing the dominoes, and then comes the whole plague. Brazil, Chile, Pinochet, Argentina, the Argentine killers who were Reagan's favorites, and so on. And it's pretty clear what they were about. So the standard scholarly source on the United States and Human Rights in Latin America by Lars Schultz, very well-known scholar, he explains that the goal of the national security states was to destroy permanently a perceived threat to the existing structure of socioeconomic privilege by eliminating the political participation of the numerical majority. That's accurate. That's what's been going on. That was what the process that was set in motion in reaction to the heresy of trying to revive Christianity. John Paul XXIII. Throughout this whole period, among the it's just a period of horrendous terror and slaughter reached Central America in the 80s. Right through this period, the practitioners of liberation theology were a prime target. Among them were the martyrs of the church, whose execution 20 years ago was commemorated last month with a resounding silence. They were killed, 6 leading Latin American intellectuals, Jesuit priests, who were murdered by an elite Salvadoran battalion, which had just come from several months of training at Fort Bragg, Special Warfare School in Fort Bragg, North Carolina, the JFK properly named Special Warfare School. And in fact, just days before the assassination, they got a refresher course from a couple of dozen special forces who were sent up there to instruct them. And then came the murders, also the murder of Julia Elba and her daughter Selena, who just happened to be there, and you're not allowed to leave any witnesses for this kind of thing. It's almost totally forgotten. One survivor, there was one survivor of the massacre, Father Jan Sobrino. He spoke at Boston College a couple of weeks ago, probably the only commemoration of any of this. He reminded the audience that Julia Elba and Selena are the symbols of the suffering masses of El Salvador and in fact the world, and therefore they must not be forgotten, just as the Jesuit intellectuals must not be forgotten, like all they symbolize. And it's therefore crucial that all of this be completely erased from memory. Now, these are not small events. This is a major war to reverse an effort to revive Christianity. Pretty significant thing. And it was passed in silence. What we do is look at the marvelous lesson of nonviolence and idealism in the other fellow's backyard. Well, there's a lot of debate about who deserves the credit for the fall of the Berlin Wall. But there's no debate at all about who deserves the credit for the 25-year war to demolish the heretical attempt to revive the Church of the Gospels. The School of the Americas, since been renamed, which is famous for training of Latin American killers, it proudly announces as one of its talking points, advertising points, that liberation theology was defeated with the assistance of the U.S. Army. No ambiguity. So, very proud of it. Well, all of this and a lot more like it, we have to drive from memory. For one reason, because it would enable us to understand what's happening in Honduras. That's just another footnote to history, following the standard pattern, and for good reasons. Good, plausible reasons which are easily understood. For the culture in general, it's highly praiseworthy to lament the crimes of official enemies. We may even castigate ourselves for our failure to do more to help the victims of our enemies. But our own crimes have to be buried very deep in Orwell's memory hole. These are crucial principles of imperial culture. They have to be guarded zealously. That's what schools and universities and newspapers and so on are about. They got to be guarded if criminal violence is going to proceed on course, always for the good of humanity, as President Obama reminded us again in the Nobel Prize address to the usual great acclaim. Thanks.
Thank you. Can you please stand up for you in the last of the debate? Stand up and give the applause. Thank you very much. Let's go for all the people who organized the event. We're not done yet. We're going to have a question and answer.
Most of the countries have thrown out the IMF. Argentina, for example, restructured and paid off its debt with the help of Venezuela. Brazil did the same. And the IMF, which is essentially a branch of the Treasury Department, was one of the techniques of control of the countries. Well, you know, that's very much weakened. And the fact that they've pretty well weathered the recession, in fact, better than Europe and the United States, again, gives them a starting point. So, but the struggle just goes on. You know, those in power domestically and those in domestic power don't give up, just like in Honduras. Same in Bolivia and other places. They want to hang on to what they want to own the countries they've already owned, always owned. And they've got help from the United States, and the one thing we can do is weaken that help. So that's up to us. But the opportunities are greater. Towns with names like San Diego and San Francisco, you know, it's, yeah, I mean, the U.S. Conquered almost half of Mexico. At first it took Texas, stole Texas for the reasons that Roosevelt explained. You can't allow the Texans to be under the rule of a weaker race. And then conquered Mexico. That was with strong support from progressives, you know, like Walt Whitman, the national poet, you know, leading progressive. I can't quote him exactly, but he wrote something about what has miserable, weak Mexico to do with the future of the noble human race. You have to remember that this was a period, and unfortunately it's not over, but this was a very overt period of extreme racism. There was an Anglo-Saxon mythology that had been developed. It was developed in England, you know, 15th century and so on. And then it was picked up in the United States. But the basic story goes back to Tacitus, that there was an Aryan race which suddenly appeared, you know, somewhere around where Iran is. And they were just a different species, tall, blonde. You go back a century, you know, the biologists were showing that their heads were rounder, you know, which is better to be a round head. And they were unique, you know, blue-eyed, blonde, conquered everything, great commitment to law and freedom and so on. And they emerged there, and then they started moving. They moved west. Everything's got to be west. So they moved to Germany, to the Black Forests, and there they became the Teutons, who were a perfect race. But then difficulties began, because some of them intermarried with the peoples near them, and so the race degenerated. And then you get the people of the Mediterranean, you know, kind of dirty and dark-haired and things like that. But the real good ones just exterminated everyone, so they kept the purity of the race. And the good ones became the Angles and the Saxons, who went to the English Channel and then crossed it and exterminated everyone, and they maintained racial purity. They didn't get rid of all the Celts. Some of them hung around in Ireland and places like that, but they did a pretty good job of it. And then after that, they went to the colonists came to America, going west, and that's us. You know, we're the Anglo-Saxons, and you get it in Thomas Jefferson. You know, like it's universal in the 19th century. We're the Anglo-Saxons. Jefferson and others thought we ought to go back to the 8th century before the race was poisoned by, you know, immigration to England from elsewhere than the Norman conquest, when they had the perfect system of laws and the most just so-and-so. And the racial characteristics were pretty precise. Like Benjamin Franklin, he didn't think the Germans qualified. He said they were a little too swarthy, you know, and they didn't pick up our customs properly. And then by the time you get to, and of course the Native Americans, well, obviously an inferior race, so therefore it was right to exterminate them. And as Roosevelt pointed out in the quotes that I mentioned, they were the beneficiaries of our exterminating them, just like the Filipinos and so on, because that was a sacrifice to create a superior race and so on. I mean, racism in the United States is not just anti-black racism. It's far deeper. And that's why every wave of immigrants has been treated with real racial abuse. I mean, take, say, Boston, like, I mean, a century ago now, a century and a half ago in Boston, the Irish were considered like dogs. You know, you'd have restaurants with signs saying, "No dogs are Irish." And the average lifespan of an Irish male was, I think, under 20 years old. You know, and the so-called Huns were treated the same way. Everyone from southeastern Europe, the Jews. The worst were the Chinese. The first total racial exclusion act was against the Chinese. They were afraid of them. But then comes along the move to the West. You know, after you've conquered the national territory, conquered Mexico, superior race, and so on. You have to move west. Then comes 1898, conquer, steal basically Hawaii, conquer the Philippines, kill a couple 100,000 of them, and then the idea is to go on to China. At that point, Theodore Roosevelt made one of his major contributions, which laid the basis for the Pacific Wars of the Second World War. He designated the Japanese as honorary Aryans. So they were not, they looked yellow, but they really weren't. So they could be civilized, and they could sort of pave our way into China and the East, and we keep going until we circle the earth and get back to our original homeland, you know, wherever it was, like Iran or something. And you know, this is a dominant ideology. It's all over the place, you know. So yeah, conquest of Mexico was part of that. There was another reason for it. You're supposed to, you've taken economics courses, I guess, those of you who had the tragedy of going to college or something. So if you take an economics course, you read Adam Smith. Actually, you worship Adam Smith. You don't read him. If you read him, you learn things that you're not supposed to know. But, for example, he was against division of labor. That's not supposed to know that. But he did give advice to the United States, to the new colonies. And his advice to them was exactly the advice, pretty much, that economists today give to the Third World. He said, you got to follow efficient principles in the United States if you want to develop. And efficient principles mean you pursue your own comparative advantage. The term hadn't yet been introduced, but he described it, is do what you're good at, like raising fur and, you know, catching fish and so on, and rely on superior British manufacturers. That gives economic efficiency. It's exactly what we tell the world. And he said, furthermore, you know, you happen to have a lot of resources there, but don't monopolize them. Now, the major resource in those days was cotton. Cotton was kind of like oil today. It was the fuel of the Industrial Revolution, which started off everywhere with textiles. So you guys grow a lot of cotton, but don't monopolize it, because monopolies are economically inefficient. You know, you can prove that. Now you can prove it with theorems, then you could just prove it without theorems. But, so that was the advice. Well, you know, the United States did manage to shake off the British, so it didn't have to follow sound economic principles. And therefore, Alexander Hamilton created an import substitution economy. The U.S. forgot about comparative advantage, had very high tariffs to keep out superior British goods. This went right through the 19th century. It was able to develop a textile industry and a steel industry, had the highest tariffs in the world. This went on to the mid-20th century. As far as monopolies were concerned, the U.S. tried hard to monopolize cotton. That's what the Texas annexation and the Mexican War were largely about. The idea of the Jacksonian Democrats, Polk and Tyler and those guys, is that if we can conquer these areas, we will be able to get a monopoly over cotton production, and we'll be able to bring the British to their knees. Remember, the British were the big enemy. They were the powerful country in those days. So we'll be able to bring them to their knees by monopolizing cotton. In fact, what they were doing is what Saddam Hussein was accused of doing, crazily, when he invaded Kuwait. You remember the line, he's going to conquer Saudi Arabia and take all the oil, and we'll be all dead for some reason. Well, that was a fantasy, but what happened with the cotton was not a fantasy. And that was a substantial part of the reason for conquering Texas, stealing, and then stealing what's now California, Arizona, New Mexico, parts of Utah, and the whole Southwest. I mean, there were other reasons, like the racist reasons, but this was a part of it. So there's a lot. History is actually an interesting topic, like you said. There's a lot of interesting things in it if you don't stay with what you're taught in school and you actually look into what happened. So yeah, you should know about the Mexican War. It was 1846 to 48. Yeah. Colombia is Colombia has far and away the worst human rights record in Latin America since around 1990. After, through the 80s, the worst atrocities were carried out by the U.S.-backed dictatorships. El Salvador, Guatemala was probably the worst, and so on. Through the 90s, Colombia got the championship, became the leading human rights violator, and almost reflexively, it became the leading recipient of U.S. military aid in the hemisphere. Now, Colombia has a long history of violence and terror and so on, but took off again in the 90s, and it became the leading recipient of U.S. military aid outside of Turkey. Turkey was carrying out even more atrocities, so they were ahead of Colombia. By the late 90s, the Turkish atrocities declined and Colombia moved into first place. Actually, I'm putting aside Israel and Egypt, which are a separate category. But outside that category, Colombia won the championship in the Western Hemisphere and then in the world by the late 90s. That was called Plan Colombia. It was a Clinton plan. It was technically directed against, it was supposedly directed against drug trafficking, but it's mostly counterinsurgency. I mean, I actually have been down there in southern Colombia. It's a miserable place. The peasants down there are the campesinos, the Afro-Colombians, indigenous people are being attacked by everybody you can imagine. They're being attacked by the military, by the paramilitaries. Now they're being attacked by FARC, the guerrillas. One of probably the only real achievement of Plan Colombia, Clinton's Plan Colombia, was to militarize the conflict so completely that the guerrilla movements, which had some kind of a social base and social programs, just turned into another army preying on the peasants. So now they're under attack by all of them, but probably the worst of all is the U.S. Air Force, or actually, it's called the Colombian Air Force, but the U.S. planes, probably mercenaries flying them, who are carrying out chemical warfare and just destroying everything. It's called fumigation, and it's supposedly, it's supposed to kill coca plants, but of course it kills everything else too. And what it does is drive the peasants off the land, and Colombia now has the second largest displaced persons population in the world after Sudan. They're all off in the slums somewhere around, around the cities. And as soon as they're driven off the land, in come the big mining corporations, to agribusiness and Monsanto with monocrop, genetically modified agriculture, and ranches owned by rich people and so on. And it's a real horror story, actually, just to tell you I mean, I was supposed to go down there right after Christmas, but just a couple of days ago I was told by human rights activists that it's too violent to go there, so you can't go right now. Well, okay, that's called pacification or something. But the Colombian government is the one close U.S. ally. It stands out from the region. And that's why the bases went to Colombia. This question of the drugs is something that really ought to be thought about. I mean, it is taken for granted in the United States that we have the right to establish military bases in other countries, to send troops in, and CIA and DEA agents and so on, to get them to stop producing a product that we don't like. Now, hard drugs aren't good for anybody, but if you compare it with, say, tobacco, I mean, it's undetectable. Deaths from tobacco are way higher than deaths from all the hard drugs together, and soft drugs like cannabis, marijuana. Maybe it's not good for you, but it's not a killer. Furthermore, tobacco kills other people. Way more people die from passive smoking than die from hard drugs. Passive smoking, meaning you're around somebody who's smoking. Well, suppose that, say, China established military bases in Colombia to carry out chemical warfare in Kentucky and North Carolina to destroy this lethal crop that's killing huge numbers of Chinese. I mean, is that all right? I mean, it's part of the imperial mentality is it doesn't register. Since we're the owners of the world, we can do anything we want, And if we want to, say, invade Afghanistan because we don't like somebody, or we want to carry out chemical warfare in southern Colombia because they're doing something we claim then okay, we have a perfect right to do it. All right, putting that aside, you have to really ask yourself whether controlling coca production has anything to do with the purpose of all of this. I mean, there's a principle of law, well-known principle of law, that you can infer intention from predictable consequences of actions, okay? Now, for decades, the United States has been fighting what's called a drug war to try to get rid of, say, opium production. It's had essentially no effect on opium production, but it has had other effects, perfectly predictable effects. In Colombia, it's a cover for counterinsurgency. In the United States, it's a technique for reintroducing slavery. What it's done, in effect, in the United States, since the drug war was escalated by Nixon, a little bit after that, mainly since the Reagan years, is to just shoot the incarceration rate up to the sky, and it's mostly black males. Well, you look at the history of African Americans, it's been slavery all the way. I mean, everybody knows, that aside from free blacks, it was slavery up till the Civil War. But what is less known is that there was a period, 10-year period called Reconstruction, when there was sort of kind of freedom. But after Reconstruction, there was a compact of the North and the South to essentially reinstitute slavery. And the way it was done was by criminalizing black life. So if a black man is standing on a street corner and, you can arrest him for vagrancy. If he doesn't look down properly when a white woman passes, you can arrest him for, attempted rape or something. And once they're in jail, they're there forever, because you can't pay the judges and you can't pay the lawyers and so on. So essentially black life was criminalized, and you had a new slave class, which was worse than slavery, for good capitalist reasons. If you own a slave, he's capital. You got to maintain him. If you're just taking a slave out of the criminal system and putting him to work in a mine or a factory, he's dispensable. It's kind of like free labor. You just throw him out. So, in fact, it was worse than slavery. And it's the basis for a large part of the American Industrial Revolution. The mines and the steel mills and so on. A lot of it was in the southern areas where it was based on slave labor. Well, that went on until the Second World War. During the Second World War, you needed free labor for, war plants and so on. And then for a couple of decades after the Second World War, there was a substantial economic growth, industrial growth. So black men could get jobs as auto workers, and they could start moving into relatively decent life. Well, by the 70s, that essentially was over. The economy moved towards financialization, towards elimination of the industrial production. The neoliberal policies were introduced. You've got this huge superfluous population again. What do you do with them? Throw them into jail. And in fact, that's exactly what happened. So the consequence of the drug war here was primarily, domestically, it was to re-incarcerate a large part of the black population, also Hispanic population, and to and in fact, they are again factory labor. So they're cheap and easily exploitable labor. It's called voluntary, but when you're in jail, voluntary has a special meaning. But when people complain about, say, Guantanamo, it's kind of a little ironic because American prisons aren't that much different. They're torture chambers. It's a horrible system. So that's one effect at home. The effect abroad is counterinsurgency. And there were other consequences. It's a way of frightening the rest of the population here, imposing what's called law and order. So if you want to frighten and control the population, they have to be afraid of something. And they can be afraid of, Hispanic narco-traffickers trying to destroy us and that sort of thing. And that worked very well. So it's had and the fact that it consistently fails in its alleged purpose, namely reducing drug use or even availability of drugs, doesn't matter because it's succeeding in its actual purposes. You'd think that we'd be able to understand that. In fact, the three quite conservative Latin American ex-presidents, Zedillo, Cardozo, and Gaviria, I think, about a year ago, headed a study which called for just elimination of the drug war. They said it's got nothing to do with controlling drugs. And a lot of Latin American countries, I don't know if Honduras is involved, but others are just reducing, slowly decriminalizing drugs for personal use and so on. The U.S. wants to maintain it, but I think that's because it has other functions. Now, Colombia is right at the center of this. Colombia may not be the main producer of poppy anymore. It very well might be Mexico. Mexico is now a major narco state. There are huge areas of Mexico near the border which are just given over to the northern border, U.S. border, to opium production. And the U.S. pretends it doesn't know anything about it. But journalists in Mexico say that you could just, fly over it in a Piper Cub or something. You can just see it. You can't miss it. A lot of these are areas from which the population essentially fled as a result of NAFTA, which undermines agricultural production. It's one of its purposes. So people flee to the cities, and you have big open areas, and the drug cartels pick them up, and they're apparently protected by the army and the narco-traffickers who work together. And it's claimed that about 25% of the Mexican economy is now just narco-trafficking. But we don't decertify Mexico because it's an ally. But Colombia is the one real holdout in Latin America so far. But it's it's a pretty ugly place. On the other hand, to get back to an earlier question, I don't really think it can be used as a base for attacking other places in Latin America. There's just not the capacity for that. But it was much more striking in other parts of the country, like the Midwest and the Southwest. And in fact, what happened is that a very substantial mass movement developed of solidarity which was something totally new in the history of imperialism. I mean, thousands, probably tens of thousands of people, many from church groups, many from evangelical groups, went down to Central America to live with people in very dangerous situations, to help them and just to give them some protection by the presence of a white face. You know, I mean, that never happened in the whole history of imperialism. Like, nobody from France ever went to live in an Algerian village to protect people, or in Vietnam, nobody thought of it. But it turned into a major mass movement. I remember going to, churches in Kansas, rural Kansas, where people knew more about Central America than anybody around here. That's certainly more than the CIA, but that's not much of a compliment. And a lot of them stayed, especially the evangelicals. And out of that grew other movements like Witness for Peace and the Christian protection groups, which are all over the world. And they do very important things. I mean, they're in the Middle East, they're in Asia, everywhere. It's not as it wasn't as visible as, say, the 60s demonstrations, for the same reason, because it was, it's in the mainstream. It's in sort of rural towns in Maryland or in Kansas and things like that, and that doesn't make the news, but it was happening, and a lot of it remained, and it's the basis for the existing solidarity movements which have spread. There isn't the kind of organized activism about Central America that there was during the period of the big massacres. So when you're killing a couple 100,000 people, and this tortures and massacres and this sort of thing, well, then this is a lot easier to organize people. When it's happening sort of quietly and you're just back to normal repression and suffering, it's more invisible. So you don't have civil disobedience and people getting arrested and things like what you described, but it's latent, and I think it can be brought back.
I'll say a word about what was going on over there. It was very clear that the Reagan government wanted an outright declared war.
U.S. bases. I mean, they're a threat to the region, and in fact, right after the bases were established, there was a meeting of UNASUR, the Union of South American Nations, or whatever, the newly formed organization that met somewhere in Argentina, to consider the problem of the bases. And it is regarded as a threat to the region, but the chances that the U.S. would use the bases to invade Venezuela, I think, are pretty slight. I mean, the U.S. just doesn't have the capacity to invade other countries at this point. I mean, they're a threat to the region. And in fact, right after the bases were established, there was a meeting of UNASUR, the Union of South American Nations, or whatever, the newly formed organization that met somewhere in Argentina, to consider the problem of the bases. And it is regarded as a threat to the region, but the chances that the U.S. would use the bases to invade Venezuela, I think, are pretty slight. I mean, the U.S. just doesn't have the capacity to invade other countries at this point. It's stretched to the limits, if not beyond. And I don't think they could get away with it either. South America would blow up. So they're a threat. But I think the real threat is what came out in the leaked Air Force documents, that it's a component of a surveillance and control system that extends over the hemisphere, most of the hemisphere, and links up to the Africa Command, which is relatively new, and is part of the system of controlling Africa, and it's part of now a global system. The U.S. is the only country in the world that has anything like a global system of surveillance and control and potential aggression. But if they're going to use forces anywhere, I suspect it would be client forces. And I don't think Colombia wants to get into a war at this point.